I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but here we are. When my wife Sarah and I moved into Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago, it felt like a dream come true. The neighborhood boasted beautiful homes, manicured lawns, and a community pool just 2 blocks away. Perfect for our son, Max, who has cystic fibrosis and relies on swimming therapy. What we didn't anticipate was Karen Willoughby, the Homeowners Association president who ruled the neighborhood like her own private kingdom. Karen was the definition of suburban entitlement, mid-50s, with a blonde bob that never seemed to shift out of place, designer sunglasses always perched on her head, and a voice sharp enough to cut through steel whenever she sniffed out a supposed violation. She practically worshipped the HOA rulebook. At meetings, she'd remind everyone in a condescending sing-song tone, the bylaws are what keep our property values high. Our first clash was minor, or at least I thought it was. I'd installed a small ramp at our front entrance to make it easier for Max to get in and out with his medical equipment. The contractor assured me it was within code, but that didn't stop Karen from striding up our driveway one Saturday, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said sweetly, though her eyes gave her away. I don't recall the Architectural Review Committee approving this modification. She gestured at the ramp as though it were a heap of trash. I calmly explained that it was a medical necessity and showed her the section of the Americans with Disabilities Act that protected our right to install it. She smiled tightly and walked away, but I knew this wasn't the end. Over the next few months, violation notices started piling up, trash cans left out for 30 minutes too long, fence trim touched up with eggshell white instead of the approved pearl. My personal favorite, a citation for excessive medical equipment visible through windows. She met Max's nebulizer in the living room. I fought back on every single one. I'm not a lawyer, but I am an engineer. And if there's one thing I do well, it's research. I dug into every code, every regulation, every protection we had, and it became clear Karen hated being challenged, especially by someone who could outquote her precious rulebook. Things escalated when I installed a small backup generator. Living in an area prone to outages, we couldn't risk Max missing a treatment. The unit was code compliant, tucked behind a lattice screen, and barely audible. Yet less than 24 hours later, Karen appeared at my door. "Generators are expressly prohibited under Section 7.3 of the Covenants," she announced. Arms crossed. "It's an eyesore and a noise nuisance." I invited her to listen. She did reluctantly then. I pointed out it was quieter than her husband's vintage Mustang, which she revved up every Sunday morning. I also reminded her that this, too, was protected as a reasonable medical accommodation. Her smile turned cold. "We'll see about that." The board meets next week. That board was stacked with Karen's loyalists, but I came armed with evidence printouts of laws, doctor's notes, and even a pulmonologist who joined via video call to explain the generator's necessity. With legal liability staring them in the face, the board voted to approve an exception. Karen's knuckles whitened around her gavel, but she said nothing. As I left, she brushed past me and muttered, "This isn't over." I dismissed it as bluster. That was my mistake. The following month, we took Max to visit his grandparents for the weekend. When we returned Sunday evening, I noticed something immediately. The generator was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen, but the security footage told a different story. There was Karen, 7:15 Saturday morning, directing 2 men in plain coveralls as they disconnected and hauled it away. She stood there, arms folded, checking her watch like she was orchestrating a military operation. Then she smiled as the truck drove off. I was furious. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was theft. Medical equipment worth over $2,000. Equipment my son depended on. I called the police. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the footage and explained everything. One officer raised his eyebrows. "Senora Willoughby?" The HOA president? He shook his head. We've had calls about her before. They took my statement and the video. Since the stolen property exceeded $1,000 in value, they explained, this wasn't petty theft. It was gran larcenia. Felony, the officers assured me they'd take it from there and suggested I contact our insurance company in the meantime. Less than an hour later, I watched from my front window as a cruiser pulled up in front of Karen Isapristi in Colonial, just 3 doors down. The officers spoke with her on the porch for several minutes. Even from a distance, I could see the shift in her posture from smug indignation to visible unease. She gestured wildly, no doubt spinning some story about how she was enforcing HOA rules. The next morning, while I was working from home, the sound of commotion drew me to the window. There was Karen being escorted to a police car, hands cuffed behind her back. The officers weren't rough, but they were clearly done entertaining her excuses. Neighbors began to emerge, phones in hand, watching in disbelief as the self-appointed Queen Bee of Oak Ridge Estates was placed in the back of a cruiser. Neighbors emerged from their homes, staring in disbelief as the HOA Queen Bee was placed in the back of a police cruiser. My phone started buzzing with text messages from neighbors who had witnessed the scene. Apparently, when questioned further, Karen had refused to disclose the location of our generator, insisting she had the right to remove it as HOA president. This escalated from a civil matter to criminal obstruction. I later learned from Detective Rivera, who followed up with me that afternoon, that Karen had paid a landscaping company to remove the generator, telling them she was authorized by the homeowner to have it taken away. She had then arranged for it to be stored at her brother-in-law's warehouse in the next county over. We've recovered your property, Detective Rivera informed me with a small smile. It appears to be undamaged, and Mrs. Willoughby has been charged with grand larceny, filing a false report, and obstruction of justice. Given that this involved medical equipment for a child, the district attorney is taking it quite seriously. Karen was released on bail that evening. I saw her return home, escorted by her husband, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in a day. She glanced at our house with a mixture of hatred and fear, quickly looking away when she noticed me watching from the window. The following week, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Karen's vice president, a nervous man named Doug, who had always been her faithful yes-man, presided. Instead, the atmosphere was tense as he announced that Karen had been temporarily removed from her position pending the resolution of her legal issues. When the floor opened for comments, several neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak up recounted their own horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. It was like a dam had broken. Years of accumulated grievances poured out as people described arbitrary fines, personal vendettas, and selective enforcement of rules. By the meeting's end, a motion had been proposed and overwhelmingly passed to permanently remove Karen from the board. As the votes were tallied, Karen, who had been sitting silently in the back row, stood up abruptly. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I've given 8 years to this community. I've kept your property values high. I've protected the integrity of this neighborhood." Her voice cracked as she looked around the room, finding no sympathy in the faces staring back at her. "This is all your fault," she suddenly screeched, pointing directly at me. "You and your special needs, and special exceptions, and special equipment." Her husband tried to guide her toward the exit, but she shook him off. The room fell silent as she stood there, mascara beginning to streak down her face. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my real estate business?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Who's going to list their home with someone facing felony charges?" It was the first time I'd seen genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing control or power, but fear of real-world consequences. The legal fees alone would be substantial, but the damage to her professional reputation in our small community might be irreparable. Without another word, She turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a finality that seemed to punctuate the end of her reign. Doug cleared his throat awkwardly and moved on to the next agenda item. But I barely heard him. Primera dorla. His still. Processing the fact that after months of harassment and intimidation, justice had finally caught up with Karen Willoughby, and all it took was her own hubris leading her to commit a felony on